It was a calm Tuesday morning when Jake Reynolds found the first letter in his mailbox. He wasn't expecting anything unusual, maybe a utility bill or a coupon catalog, but instead, he held an envelope stamped with the emblem of the Silverwood Pines Homeowners Association. Curious, he opened it while walking back to his house, coffee in hand. The content made him stop in his tracks. According to the letter, a portion of his driveway was allegedly encroaching on shared community space and would need to be removed or altered within 30 days. The tone was formal, almost threatening, suggesting further action would be taken if Jake did not comply. Confused, Jake stepped into his garage and pulled out a manila folder containing all the documents he'd received when purchasing the house 12 years ago. He had the original property survey, the closing paperwork, and even a certificate of boundary approval from the county office. Everything was clear. The driveway, every inch of it, was part of his legal property. He even remembered the previous owner mentioning the extended driveway as one of the perks. So how could it now be considered communal? Jake made a call to the HOA office, hoping to clear things up. A receptionist answered, took down his name and address, and promised a call. Back from the board, 2 days passed. Instead of a callback, he received another letter, this one more stern, emphasizing a final notice and referencing bylaws that had supposedly been updated in the most recent HOA meeting. Jake hadn't attended that meeting, mainly because he didn't think changes could affect something so fundamental as his own driveway. It appeared he was wrong. Determined to get answers, he attended the next HOA meeting at the clubhouse. The room was full of familiar faces, neighbors who mostly stayed out of each other's business. The board sat at a long folding table with nameplates and water bottles, presenting themselves with the self-importance of minor royalty. Jake waited until the Q&A portion and raised his concern. The board president, a man named Carl Whitmore with a rigid posture and an even stiffer smile, told Jake the HOA had voted to reclassify certain strips of land throughout the neighborhood to make way for a unified aesthetic. Apparently, Jake's extra-wide driveway didn't fit that vision. "But that's my property," Jake said, holding up his paperwork. Carl glanced at it, shrugged, and said the board had already made its decision. "You're welcome to appeal," he added dryly, passing Jake a form. The appeal, Jake learned later, required a $500 non-refundable fee and had a 6-week turnaround time, long after the HOA's 30-day warning period would expire. That night, Jake sat in his living room, fuming. He wasn't the type to pick fights, but he also wasn't going to roll over and give up land he rightfully owned. Something about the smugness in Carl's voice and the complete disregard for his legal documents lit a fire in him. He poured a drink, sat at his computer, and began researching. He found cases in other states where HOAs had tried similar stunts, rezoning or reclassifying property to gain control over parts of residents' land. Most of them failed when met with proper resistance. What was happening wasn't new. It was just wrapped in bureaucratic language designed to confuse. Jake realized this wasn't just about a driveway. It was about standing up against the quiet tyranny of an overreaching board. He didn't know how yet, but one thing was certain. He was going to fight this. And he wouldn't stop until he not only kept his driveway, but made a point so strong, so undeniable, that the HOA would never forget it. Jake's living room transformed into a war room overnight. The coffee table, once used for casual magazines and remote controls, was now stacked with property maps, printed laws, and HOA bylaws highlighted in angry yellow streaks. His laptop blinked with open browser tabs, each leading to municipal codes, land use rights, and court cases involving homeowners taking on their associations. What had started as confusion was now a quiet fury. Jake was not just trying to protect a few square feet of concrete. He was preparing to dismantle the flawed logic of a system that thought it could bully people into submission. The first person Jake called was his old college friend Greg, a real estate attorney based in a neighboring city. Greg listened patiently as Jake explained the situation. After a long pause, Greg said, "Sounds like your HOA is trying to pull a fast one, but you're right to be cautious. This could get messy if they've manipulated zoning language. Jake sent him scans of all his property documents. That night, Greg called back, voice more animated this time. Your deed is solid, and the original survey clearly includes the driveway. But they're trying to reframe it as part of a shared use easement zone, something that didn't even exist when your property was built. That's the trick. They're using a recent zoning amendment to justify a land grab. Jake felt the knot in his stomach tighten. Can they do that? Only if no one fights it, Greg replied. With that unsettling truth, Jake dove deeper into legal territory. He read until his eyes ached, learning about easements, grandfathered clauses, and obscure local ordinances. That's when he found something interesting buried in the municipal code, a clause that most residents likely overlooked. It stated that any homeowner affected by zoning reclassification must still be granted unrestricted ingress and egress access to their dwelling using pre-existing functional infrastructure unless deemed a hazard or public nuisance. Jake read the sentence 3 times, then again. This was it, the loophole. If they tried to take or alter his driveway, they had to provide a way for him to access his property just as freely as before. No shared path, no limited access gate. It had to be direct, usable, and unobstructed. That clause wasn't just legal leverage, it was a weapon. The next few days, Jake stopped sleeping properly. He started sketching rough diagrams, not just of defensive structures, but of something creative, even ridiculous, something that would both follow the law and make a bold statement. He smiled to himself as he scribbled ideas onto a notepad. Access guaranteed, infrastructure in place. What if the access was elevated or controlled? What if I built around the rules? The idea hit him while watching a documentary about ancient castles. Moats weren't just defensive, they were a declaration. A moat was the architectural version of saying, "You shall not pass." And more importantly, no one could argue a moat wasn't providing access, so long as there was a working bridge. He closed the documentary and immediately searched for engineering plans, scale models, water systems, and soil integrity. Could a moat actually be done in a suburban setting? Was it legal? More digging revealed that ornamental water features, even those encircling property, were allowed so long as they met safety codes and did not impede stormwater flow or drainage. Bridges, automated or manual, could be installed with permits. It was doable. Wild, but doable. Jake called Greg again, giddy with the absurdity of what he was about to say. "I've got a plan," he said. "They want to play with technicalities? Fine. I'm going to give them a legally compliant, fully permitted middle finger in the form of a moat, with a remote-controlled drawbridge." There was a beat of silence. Then Greg laughed. "Jake, that's either genius or insane." "Why? Not both?" Jake replied, already opening a new browser tab labeled Custom Hydraulic Bridge Systems. By the time Jake submitted his permit application to the county, the vision was clear in his mind. What started as a tongue-in-cheek sketch had evolved into a full-fledged construction plan, complete with dimensions, engineering specs, water, circulation diagrams, and even a sensor-activated bridge blueprint. It wasn't just a wild idea anymore. It was a project. And more importantly, it was perfectly legal. The town clerk, initially bewildered when reading through the plans, had double-checked everything with the zoning department. Jake's documents were airtight. His moat would be classified as a landscape, water feature, and the bridge was listed as a private access structure. No ordinance prohibited it. The safety plan included fencing, lighting, and motion sensors. The approvals came through with a shrug and a signature. He had his green light. Within a week, trucks started arriving. The neighbors gathered slowly. Over the first few days, sipping coffee and watching as Jake's yard was sectioned off. A trench was marked in spray paint, encircling the section of driveway under dispute. HOA board members, especially Carl Whitmore, passed by several times, pretending not to stare. But Jake saw them taking photos. Good, he thought. Let them watch. Excavation began the following Monday. A backhoe dug a clean, narrow moat, 4 feet wide and just under 3 feet deep, enough for water to circulate properly but shallow enough to meet the town's safety requirements without needing a barrier. Jake had consulted with a local landscape architect to ensure the design wouldn't interfere with underground utilities or property runoff. Every aspect of it screamed, "Compliant, but don't mess with me." As the trench was lined with a watertight concrete layer and a low-maintenance filtration pump was installed, whispers started circulating through the neighborhood. Jake didn't mind the attention. In fact, he leaned into it. He gave short, cryptic answers to those who asked what he was building. A demonstration, he'd say with a smirk. Or, an invitation to reconsider land rights. When the bridge components arrived, things got interesting. The structure was sleek, made of reinforced aluminum, hydraulic pistons, and a deck that looked like something out of a Bond film. It was automated and could be activated by a small key fob, a numeric keypad mounted beside the mailbox, or even a motion sensor. Jake spent 3 days helping the crew install it, making sure every bolt, every wire, was correctly placed. Makes. Bridge retracted vertically into a mechanical housing unit disguised as a decorative stone feature when not in use. When deployed, it lowered with a quiet hum and clicked securely into place over the water. On the 5th day, Jake tested the system. He stood by his gate, clicked the fob, and watched with satisfaction as the bridge extended smoothly across the water. It was surreal, like watching a movie come to life. More than anything, it was a message to the HOA. You don't get to bully people with paperwork. The final touch was cosmetic. Jake landscaped the edges of the moat with flat stones, added soft LED lights along the inside curve, and placed 2 large planters at the base of the bridge's control post. From a distance, it looked elegant, almost artistic, but it was undeniably functional. Anyone wanting to step foot onto Jake's driveway now needed either the code or permission. By the end of the week, Jake's house had become the talk of the town. Some neighbors called it eccentric, others brilliant, but most agreed on one thing. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. Children were fascinated, local passers-by stopped to stare, and even the mail carrier made a point of saying, "That's the coolest damn driveway I've ever seen." Jake stood outside one evening, hands on his hips, watching the water reflect the soft glow of the bridge lights. The HOA had tried to box him in with rules. Instead, he'd redefined the box entirely. Jake's moat was barely a week old when the HOA finally responded. Predictably, it came not with a knock at the door or a phone call, but with yet another official letter. This one was more aggressive than the others, accusing Jake of violating several community aesthetic standards and suggesting that his moat created an atmosphere inconsistent with the character of the neighborhood. The letter ended with a veiled threat. He had 10 days to remove the structure or face fines of up to $500 per day. Jake didn't even blink. He had been expecting this. In fact, he'd already prepared his response. With copies of his building permits, town approvals and safety inspection reports in hand, he drafted a formal reply and mailed it the same day. His message was short, direct, and calm. Everything they hated. He explained that the structure was fully legal, complied with all local codes, and was protected under property rights. He even attached a highlighted section of the HOA's own bylaws stating that modifications to private property were acceptable if they adhered to local regulations. The next HOA meeting was unusually crowded. Word had spread quickly, and Jake's project had become a lightning rod in the community. Some residents attended out of curiosity. Others came to voice their opinions, both for and against. Jake arrived early, sitting quietly in the front row. Carl Whitmore, the HOA president, looked visibly annoyed when he entered and saw Jake already there, arms crossed, calm as ever. Carl opened the meeting with the usual roll call and reports, but the tension in the room was thick when the Time came for community concerns. Jake stood and addressed the room. He presented his case in a measured tone, laying out the facts. The HOA's sudden reclassification attempt, the legality of his construction, and the baseless accusations against him. "I didn't build a moat to be dramatic," Jake said, locking eyes with Carl. "I built it to protect my rights, and the law is on my side." Carl tried to push back, speaking about preserving neighborhood values and maintaining uniformity. But it didn't land. Jake, having done his homework, responded with court precedents, county maps, and inspection reports. Every challenge Carl raised was met with calm, irrefutable evidence. Then something unexpected happened. One by one, neighbors began speaking up. An elderly woman, Mrs. Dorsey from 2 doors down, raised her hand and said, "I think it's creative, and frankly I'm tired of being told what color my flower pots can be." Another neighbor mentioned being fined for installing solar panels. A young couple in the back, new to the neighborhood, said they had been denied a patio expansion without explanation. The room slowly shifted. What began as a meeting about Jake's violation turned into a public airing of grievances about the HOA's overreach. People were no longer whispering behind doors. They were fed up and vocal. Realizing the tide was turning, Carl attempted to regain control of the meeting, banging his gavel and insisting the discussion was off topic. But it was too late. A neighbor stood up and asked if the HOA had ever voted to approve the new reclassification maps. Another pointed out that the bylaws hadn't been updated properly. Murmurs of, "We should vote them out," and "they've gone too far," began to echo through the room. Jake didn't gloat. He just watched it unfold, knowing he'd started something bigger than a property dispute. His moat was no longer just a barrier, it had become a symbol. And Carl, the man who thought he could bully him into compliance, was now visibly rattled. That night, Jake returned home, clicked the remote, and watched the bridge rise as he stepped inside. He stood for a moment, listening to the quiet flow of water below. For the first time in weeks, he felt truly at peace. Not just because he had won a battle, but because he had sparked a movement. The next few weeks felt like a slow unraveling of everything the HOA had worked to control for years. Carl Whitmore, once so confident in his grip over the community, now found himself navigating a neighborhood where his authority was openly questioned. Jake's moat, once viewed as a novelty or eccentric rebellion, had become a rallying point. People began knocking on Jake's door, not to complain but to thank him. Some brought baked goods. Others just wanted to hear the full story. A few came seeking advice for their own battles with the HOA. Jake welcomed them all with a smile, watching as his small act of defiance grew into something more powerful. At the following month's HOA meeting, a record number of residents showed up, many clutching copies of the community bylaws and recent letters they'd received. Jake sat in his usual front row seat, quiet but ready. As the meeting began, Carl's voice lacked the usual confidence. He stumbled through the agenda, skipping over the aesthetic violation enforcement section entirely. But the crowd didn't let it go. One neighbor asked why recent fines had been issued without homeowner votes. Another questioned who approved the so-called reclassification that had triggered Jake's case. The board, under pressure, tried to brush it off, but the damage had been done. Jake stood again, this time not to defend himself, but to ask the question that had been building in the minds of many. If our HOA can rewrite property lines, issue fines without transparency, and punish homeowners for harmless improvements, what exactly are we paying into? A quiet murmur turned into applause. Carl looked overwhelmed, his usual allies silent. For the first time, he was alone at the table. The momentum didn't stop there. A petition circulated that very night, one to call a special vote to restructure the HOA board. Within days, over 60% of the community had signed it. The pressure mounted quickly, and within a week, Carl announced his resignation. He claimed it was for personal reasons, but everyone knew better. Jake didn't run for the board. He had no desire to become a bureaucrat. But he did attend every meeting afterward, and so did dozens of others. A new president was elected, one who promised transparency and a review of all past complaints. Policies were rewritten, fines were suspended pending review. The board actually listened. As for the moat, it remained untouched. It had become something of a neighborhood landmark. Kids called it the Castle Bridge, and visitors asked if they could see it in action. Jake embraced the attention in his own quiet way. One weekend, he hosted a backyard barbecue, inviting everyone from the neighborhood. The invitation featured a drawing of a tiny castle tower and the words, "Bridge opens at sunset." People showed up in droves, laughing, eating, and watching. The drawbridge rise and lower like clockwork. Someone even brought a toy dragon and floated it down the moat. Jake laughed harder than he had in years. Later that evening, as the last guests were leaving, and the lights around the moat glowed softly, in the dusk, Jake stood by the water and took it all in. What had started as a petty legal threat had become a symbol of what could happen when someone stood their ground. He didn't just keep his driveway, he helped take back his neighborhood. He pressed the button on his key fob and watched the bridge rise one final time for the night. As it clicked into its resting position, Jake turned toward his house, a small grin on his face. The HOA had tried to bury him in red tape. Instead, they'd helped him build a legend.